Brian Lehrer on WNYC. And now, back to our WNYC Centennial series, 100 Years of 100 Things. We did 100 Years of the New Yorker earlier in the show. And now, ahead of the Grammy Awards, which will be presented Sunday night, it's thing number 64, 100 Years of the Billboard Music Charts. According to the Library of Congress, it was exactly 100 years ago, 1925, that electrical recording was successfully implemented and introduced by both Columbia and Victor Records. And in 1926, in the era that became known as the Jazz Age, there were things like this: Red Hot Peppers by Jelly Roll Morton. Just a little taste of a Red Hot Pepper by Jelly Roll Morton from 1926. We'll sample from each decade in this 100-year segment. Should be a lot of fun. And actually, in those days, the Billboard music charts were sheet music charts, not yet rankings of recorded music sales. So let's talk about this history. We're very happy to have as our guide and as our guest Gary Trust, Billboard's New York-based managing director of charts and data operations. Gary, thanks a lot for coming on with us. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much, Brian. Honored to be here.
And listeners, we'll try to make this some participatory fun, too. We'll take your oral history calls in a few chronological chunks on this question. What do you remember as the biggest hit song from when you were in high school? We'll take calls first from anyone who went to high school in the 1950s or earlier. 212-433 WNYC. Again, what do you remember as the biggest hit song from when you were in high school? We'll take calls first from anyone who went to high school in the 1950s or earlier. 212-433 WNYC. 212-433-9692. Everyone else, wait up. You'll get your turn. You don't even have to have liked the song. Maybe you hated the biggest hit you remember being saturated with and you couldn't escape from high school. That's okay. Just what was the biggest hit that sticks with you today that seemed to be everywhere or that everyone was listening to when you were in high school? 212-433 WNYC. 212-433-9692. And to make it even more fun, when you get on the air, we'll give you a chance to win a Brian Lehrer Show prize if you can name a song from your decade that will play and see if you know the song or artist. If you can do it, we'll send you a Brian Lehrer Show Pro-Democracy tote. But the main thing is just your recollection. What do you remember as the biggest hit song from when you were in high school? We'll take calls first from anyone who went to high school in the 1950s or earlier. 212-433-9692 with Gary Trust from Billboard Magazine. So, Gary, the prehistory here is that the name Billboard Magazine was a reference to actual billboards in the 19th century. Do I have that right?
That is correct. I wasn't at Billboard then, but from what I know of my history, Billboard advertising. Literally, it was tracking what was on billboards throughout the country. So, even though now and for decades, Billboard has been known for tracking music. It started tracking when circuses would come to town, carnivals, vaudeville, burlesque shows as well. So it was really about entertainment, really, when it was getting into an era where it was becoming national. All these acts were traveling. So, the first issue, November 1894.
Audience. Yeah, measuring audiences. Yep, exactly. I see the sheet music charts debuted in 1910. Was that actually a list of best-selling pieces of sheet music that people were buying to play on their own instruments?
Yeah, as far as I know, there were reported lists of what was selling for sheet music. So before radio, before records and record players were really as big as they would become, entertainment for new songs was about sheet music. People would play them on their pianos in their living rooms. It was family entertainment. So you needed the sheet music generally to play that. So that's really an early barometer of musical success. What songs were people playing at home and, by sheet music.
We heard Jelly Roll Morton from 1926 to get us going. We'll dip into 1937 next decade, with a sample from a song called Powerhouse by Raymond Scott that wasn't a hit per se in its own right, but became so familiar to people. See if you recognize it as, oh, I've heard that in cartoons, because it was used in background music for action or assembly line scenes in many cartoons. Check this out. Chasing the mouse and the mouse is running away, or the cartoon character is putting widgets on the assembly line pieces as they move by a little too fast. Powerhouse just throwing in that 1930s cartoon music for a little fun. So now we get to the debut of the actual Billboard music charts in 1940. Gary, why 1940, and what did it actually measure at that time?
Yeah, so at that point, we saw, as I mentioned before, record players now were starting to become much more the currency of hit music. There were advertisements in Billboard about hundreds of thousands of phonographs in use, and how so many millions of songs were being played in jukeboxes and record players. So it evolved at that point where recorded music was now becoming so measurable. So it was actually July 27th, 1940, when Billboard published the first national top 10 singles chart based on actual sales. It was called Best Selling Retail Records. And pretty cool number one. The first one, Tommy Dorsey's I'll Never Smile Again, with vocals by somebody named Frank Sinatra, the first number one.
I think I've heard the name. Wow, the first number one, Frank Sinatra and Tommy Dorsey in 1940. Let's see, I think Eileen in Brooklyn went to high school in the 40s. Is that right, Eileen? Hi.
That's right, yes. And my favorite song was Stardust.
And was that a big hit at the time?
Yes, I think so. We danced to that.
Huh. So, okay, now we're going to give you a chance to win a Brian Lehrer Show tote if you can recognize another song from the 40s. I pulled a musical great who was popular in the 40s to sample from that decade. You tell me if you can name either the artist or the song. We'll take either one, either the artist or the song. And Gary will tell us if he made the charts much in that decade. Here we go. All right, Eileen, any idea?
Not a clue. Sorry, I don't remember so many fast songs. It was the slow, sleepy ones that I remember.
Eileen, thank you
anyway.
Thank you very much for remembering Stardust. So that was Cottontail by Duke Ellington. Gary, did Duke have commercially successful recordings in the 40s as measured by Billboard, if you know?
He did, all the way from the 40s throughout the decade, some top 10s. So Don't Get Around Much Anymore, Do Nothing Till You Hear From Me, I'm Beginning to See the Light. Those were some of his biggest hits in the mid-40s.
All right, let's see. Terry in Melbourne, Florida, went to high school in the 50s. Terry, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Yes, hi there, Brian. One of the first songs I remember was right at the threshold of high school, Little Things Mean a Lot by Kitty Callan.
Wow, never heard of that one.
And after that, there was Heartbreak Hotel with Elvis.
All right, Terry.
And I was graduated in 58.
58. Now, let's see if you can recognize this to win a Brian Lehrer Show tote, which was big near the start of the decade.
I'm a little mixed up on the field.
All Shook Up. Elvis.
That's not the one I meant to play, but you got it right, and I'll tell you why we pulled both of those. But absolutely. So hang on, Terry, and we're going to... That's not from the 1950s. That's our You Won fanfare. So we're going to send you a Brian Lehrer Show Pro-Democracy tote. Let's take another caller from the 50s. And then we're going to play the other one that I pulled, and I'll explain why we pulled two only for this decade. Susan in Rybrook, you're on WNYC. Hey, Susan, so what do you remember as the dominant song from your high school years?
Wake Up Little Susie by the Everly Brothers. As you said, my name is Susan, and I thought they were singing directly to me.
That's
and
so
when
neat.
we moved east from Michigan, from the potato capital of Michigan, in a tiny little podunk town to the east, I sat in the back seat, and the Everly Brothers sang to me, and it was just so poignant and so memorable.
That's so great. So now let's see if you can recognize this one, either the song or the artist, from the earlier 1950s.
Lonely, lovely work of art.
Susan, any idea?
An idea, but deep inside, unlike the other caller, I like the fast songs.
And that was a slow one, so you don't know it, right?
I don't.
Okay, sorry. Thanks for calling, though, Susan, with your memory. That was Mona Lisa by Nat King Cole. And this is the only decade, Gary, for which I pulled two tracks, because popular music changed so much from the beginning of the decade in ways that, you know, it separated everything that came before and everything that has come since. And that was the introduction of electricity to pop music. Do you look back on it that way?
So for the 1950s, Brian?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is definitely.
And so Mona Lisa, if we had played those in chronological order, the, wonderful but relatively traditional Nat King Cole Mona Lisa, and then Elvis is rocking out with All Shook Up by the end of the 50s, and that changed everything.
Right. So Mona Lisa was a number one hit for 2 months in 1950. And yeah, right at the middle of the decade, that's where you see Elvis comes along. He starts having a number one hit after number one hit. And he also, pretty much along with other rock and roll acts at that point, pretty much sparked the creation of the Billboard Hot 100, which now for 66 years has been the premier Billboard songs chart that ranks the number one song in the country. Back then it was based on radio airplay, sales, jukebox play. Same chart nowadays, but based on streaming, still based on radio and sales. But the methodology changes through the decades. The artists change, but the charts are always tracking what's the most popular, however people are consuming music.
And I see that Billboard introduced various charts at various times to measure different genres of music. You were just mentioning, some of the cuts on what kind of charts they had. And after the first top 10 singles chart debuted in 1940, as we discussed, I See You launched an R&B chart in 42, then the first album chart in 45, then in 59, this is hilarious, you split the album charts into best-selling stereo albums and best-selling mono albums. Really? Do you know if they were much different at any point, what people were buying in stereo and in mono?
Yeah, I would have to look at the different number ones. A lot of number ones, as far as I know, were still popular on both, but obviously enough differences that different charts were needed. Only 4 years later, Brian, they actually merged again. So as of 1963, and vinyl went away, and now vinyl is huge again. So it really is funny. I mean, even at the beginning, you mentioned Jelly Roll Morton. Here we are, 100 years later. Jelly Roll is one of the most popular artists. So it really is funny how much some things completely go away, other things come right back around.
We're in our 100 Years of 100 Things series. Thing number 64, 100 years of the Billboard music charts. We're going decade by decade with your memories, listeners, of the biggest hit from when you were in high school, and playing a little Name That Tune with you with Gary Trust from Billboard. And let's go next to Diane in Fort Monroe, Virginia, who went to high school in the 60s. Hey, Diane.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So what's the dominant song that you think of in relation to your high school years?
I remember Sherry Baby, because I would be sitting in English class. I was in a high school with no air conditioning, and the windows were huge, and the windows were always open. And a friend of mine, Warren Richards, had a convertible, and his lunch hour was at the same time as my English class. And he would drive up and down the street in front of the school playing Sherry Baby with the top down. Every day. I don't remember anything about my English class, but I remember that song.
Sherry by the Four Seasons. So now you get a 1960s Name That Tune quiz. Let's see. This one is from 1967. Let's see if you know it.
Oh, then I saw her face. Now I'm a believer. Not afraid. Put out in my mind.
All right, Diane, you know it?
Well,
artist or song? That's it. Well, that's it.
I'm a Believer.
I'm a Believer is the name of the song. Do you know what group?
Wonderful.
Just for fun?
I can't think right now.
It was the Monkees. Diane.
Oh, the Monkees. Sure.
Hang on. We're going to take your address and we'll send you a Brian Lehrer Show pro-democracy tote. So, Gary, talk about the Monkees, because when I was looking at the Billboard charts, prepping for this segment, I was thinking, okay, 1967, we're going to see Jimi Hendrix, we're going to see Sgt. Pepper's, we're going to see acid rock, and yet what's the number one song that I found on the charts? I'm a Believer. So where does the pop stuff, where do the Monkees fit in, and what else was happening?
Yeah, it's funny. I just saw Mickey Dolenz of the Monkees in concert just a month ago. He sounded great.
Plays,
I think he closed. He closed with "I'm a Believer." Everyone was singing along. It was a really fun show. They were huge. I mean, obviously the Beatles were the biggest act on the charts in the '60s up through 1970. They had 20 number ones. That's still a record on the Hot 100. That 19 number one albums. But the Monkees, similar sound in some ways. Obviously, the popularity of the TV show, which we saw with Glee in the 2010s, the power of music and TV together. So, the Monkees had 4 number one albums in 1966, 67. So, the Monkees 13 weeks at number one, more of the Monkees 18 weeks. Really one of the biggest runs at number one for a single act in the entire history of the chart, even to today.
Let's go on to Pat in Old Greenwich, who went to high school in the 70s. Hey, Pat, what song sticks with you after 50 years? Hi.
Well, I always remember this. It always comes back to me year to year because for graduation, we marched into Bridge Over Troubled Waters.
Uh-huh. And so that's
Simon and Garfunkel.
Simon and Garfunkel, a big hit. Was that a big hit on the charts, Gary?
That was number
70.
one for 6 weeks.
Yeah, all right. So you get a Name That Tune from the 1970s, Pat, and let's see if you can name either the artist or this song from 1977.
Stay away from my window. Stay away from my
I guess that's Rod Stewart.
Disconnect the telephone line. Baby, and draw that blind.
Pat, do you know it?
Yeah. That's Rod Stewart.
That absolutely is Rod Stewart with Tonight's the Night. Pat, thank you very much. And hang on, we're going to take your address and send you a Brian Lehrer Show pro-democracy tote. What would you say about the 1970s on the Billboard charts, Gary?
Yeah, so that's on number one for 8 weeks as well. But a lot of different sounds. Elton John, the singer-songwriter, a lot of disco, a lot of Bee Gees, a lot of classic rock that's still really enduring today. What's really funny is against all that, the longest leading number one of the 70s was a totally different sound. You Light Up My Life by Debbie Boone for 10 weeks. So really a little bit of everything on the charts in the 70s.
All right, we're going to go on to the 80s and another caller, but also I want to invite now, as we clear the lines of people who are calling in for those earlier decades, people to call in if you went to high school in the 90s or beyond. In the 90s or any time in the 21st century, if you were in high school anytime from 1990 forward. Now the lines are for you, 212-433-WNYC. And before we run out of time, at the top of the hour, we're going to try to squeeze in a call representing the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. So if you went to school in the 90s, the 2000s, or the 2010s, give us a call and tell us what song was so dominant in high school that you associate it with that even today. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692 with Gary Trust from the Billboard charts. And Lyron in Long Island City went to high school in the 80s, right?
Yes, Brian, it was so great to see you on MLK Day at the Apollo.
Oh, I'm glad you were there.
Yeah, it was awesome. You did an awesome job. My two songs, because my taste is eclectic, would be Raspberry Beret by Prince and Aha's Take On Me.
Neat. And you're right. Your taste is eclectic. So let's see. Maybe you'll be able to remember this hit song and recognize it from 1989.
Janet Jackson.
You got it. Miss You Much by Janet Jackson. Good job, Lyron. We're going to take your address off the air and send you a Brian Lehrer Show pro-democracy tote. And talk about the 80s. A lot of new stuff was happening in the 80s. New kinds of rock, new kinds of pop, rap was really breaking out.
Yeah, Michael Jackson, Madonna, obviously carrying the mantle for pop music. Physical by Olivia Newton-John, 10 weeks at number one, was the longest leading number one of the 80s. But yeah, Brian, you start to get, by the end of the decade, Tone Loc and Young MC, rap was starting to become more common. It would really explode in the 90s. But a lot of pop, driven by pop. Take On Me, Aha, that was a number one. Miss You Much, Janet Jackson, a number one. But yeah, by the end of the decade, it was really starting to see that music was going to splinter off in a lot of different directions into the 90s.
Carol in Brooklyn went to high school in the 90s. Hi, Carol. What song do you remember as most associated with your high school years?
Hello, it's Cheryl from Brooklyn.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had it as Carol. I
no
apologize.
worries. Remembering a song that I actually don't feel I can listen to anymore because this person has been canceled. It is R. Kelly, and the song is I Believe I Can Fly. I grew up in Chicago, and Michael Jordan's Space Jam was a big deal, and this song was everywhere and a slow dance favorite.
It was on Space Jam, and it was everywhere. I Believe I Can Fly. All right, let's see if you can recognize this song or the artist from 1999. Any idea? We're definitely genre flipping here, but any idea?
Okay. I didn't hear much, but I'm going to guess and say it was Cotton Eye Joe.
Oh, that's a good guess with the way that started out. And you have the right genre, more or less. That was the start of a song by Garth Brooks in 1999. Thank you for calling, Carol. And did Garth Brooks topped the chart, and not just the country charts, which is part of what made him so big. Is that right, Gary?
Yeah, it didn't really cross over as much as country does today. So we were starting to see that. There'd been different times in the rock era where country was big in the 70s, lots of John Denver. But Garth was just so big, genre almost didn't matter with Garth. He was one of the first artists in country to just be so big whether he was having a lot of pop hits. So, yeah, that was some of his hits in the early 90s all the way through the decade. Still some of the biggest country hits of the last 25, 30 years.
And because we're so close to being out of time, I'm just going to see if you can identify these last two as we go up the final 2 decades. How about this from 2009? We'll see if you know it, Gary Trust from Billboard.
Gotta get
I'm hitting my buzzer
Gotta
already.
get dip. Gotta get dip.
You're hitting your buzzer because it's...
That's Boom Boom Pow by Black Eyed Peas.
Black Eyed Peas. And let's jump right to the final decade that we're doing, because we're not doing the 2020s on this history segment. 2019 comes...
What do you want from me? Why don't you run from me? What are you wondering? What do you know? Why aren't you scared of me? Why do you care for me?
Do you know it, Gary?
I do. I'm so glad I got these right, hopefully. Bury a Friend by Billie Eilish.
Absolutely. So where are we now in our last 30 seconds on the Billboard music charts? What can you tell us about who we are as a culture by what music people are listening to?
Yeah, we're streaming. We're still watching and interacting on TikTok. Taylor Swift is still probably the biggest current artist. And Die With a Smile by Lady Gaga. And Bruno Mars, number one right now on the Billboard Hot 100.
Well, this has been so much fun. 100 years of the Billboard Music Charts, thing number 64 in our 100 Years of 100 Things series. Listeners, thanks for your oral histories of the biggest hits from your high school years. And Gary Trust, Billboard's New York-based Managing Director of Charts and Data Operations, thanks so much for being so game to do this with us. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.